Good evening, everyone. This is the fourth session of the American Scripture Project. I found out between the last time and this time that actually there are like 18 or 20 or something different sessions of this, and the pilot was just these six. Like the person who created it has been teaching it for like 4 or 5 years in his congregation. His name is Rabbi Michael Holtzman. And he just thought that these were really good representative sample of them for this pilot program. But apparently, like when they get all the feedback and create a course, it's going to have more sessions than just these six. So I didn't realize that, and also I have no idea what the other sessions are. Like it's not like they gave us a choice of, here are 12 sessions and pick your favorite six, like they just gave us these six. So anyway, when you're teaching a pilot course, you're trying to do it sort of as best as you can, but it's a work in progress, and your feedback really does matter a lot. So, okay, last time we talked about, I'll just say that for me, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this course is because of I was very taken by the idea of doing sort of American texts through a Jewish lens. And, in a conversation with Edith between last time and this time, I think that her, yeah, Edith, if you don't mind my sharing, Edith shared a critique that like actually there were a lot of biblical references in Frederick Douglass' speech, and we didn't even look at those at all. We looked at some of the broader themes and the way that it was connected. But if we were really looking at Frederick Douglass's speech as a Jewish text, like wouldn't we want to look at those biblical verses that were quoted and then find them in their original context, and what is the relationship between how Frederick Douglass is using them and how we're using them, and like other ways that we might use, like, if we're really serious about this idea of treating it as text, then we should treat it as text more deeply. So I'm actually hoping to do tonight's session a little bit differently from the way we've been doing it, and hopefully to get more into like the Jewish lens aspect. That said, uh, you know, tonight's topic is Reagan's very famous tear down this wall speech. And well, I'll be very frank. I was born after that. I was born after the fall of the Berlin Wall. Um, but for you all, this is a text of living memory. And uh, and so I want to start off by saying that how you relate to this session might be different from other sessions that we've done, because this is the one that is the most recent in like American history chronology. And this is one that you might well remember. You might remember it uh in from its original context in 1987, and you certainly remember how it's been used over the intervening decades and the sort of afterlife of this speech and how it is understood in the broader American context. I'm just going to share a little bit about that. This is probably not not unknown to you, but following the end of World War II, Germany was divided. At the end of World War II, there was the American, British, and French and Soviet uh, zones of Germany. And the American, British, and French zones became West Germany, and the Soviet zone became East Germany. This is the whole country of Germany. And the city of Berlin was technically in the Soviet region. It was in East Germany, but it was also split. The Russians took the eastern part of the city, and West Berlin remained under democratic West German control. And so Berlin becomes the front line between the Soviet communist regime and its opponents in the West. The Marshall Plan, which was an American sponsored plan that the whole international community, like basically for the first time in history, took a defeated enemy and propped it up economically, which was was not how most wars ended, right? Like when people talk about the, you know, the Pax Americana and like the new world order, and like one of the things that they think is so unique about that period of the second half of the 20th century is that Germany like immediately gets welcomed back into the fold of the West. At least West Germany does. And you know, that's uh um the Marshall Plan is not just humanitarian, it is also a bulwark against communist expansion, and it represents something very, very different from especially the way that Germany was treated after World War One, which I think the nations of the world were very wary of because led to um, that led to the rise of extremist parties in Germany and Italy and some other places that created a fascist axis that then went back to war with the world, and that's part of the history. So the Soviets, they tried to starve West Berlin in order to take the whole city of Berlin, but the United States airlifted food and supplies into West Berlin to break the blockade. In 1961, East Germans began laying bricks and barbed wire to form a barrier between East and West Berlin, and that barrier eventually became the Berlin Wall. In 1963, JFK gave a famous speech also about the Berlin Wall, where he stands there in front of the wall and he says, Ich bin ein Berliner, right? I am also from Berlin. And he celebrates West Berlin as a symbol of freedom and democracy and resistance to tyranny and oppression and Soviet rule. And that speech, the JFK speech, gave that wall a symbolic significance that was greater than its security significance. It became sort of the symbolic barrier, separator between the East and the West. On June 12th, 1987, in the final years of his presidency, Ronald Reagan delivered this speech, which at the time was considered kind of minor and unimpressive. The Soviet Union was viewed as a solid global empire. Reagan's rhetoric and his call to tear down the wall were designed to undermine that power, but the speech was widely perceived as a rhetorical overreach and an attempt to burnish his reputation back home in the face of the Iran-Contra scandal and other things that were going on at home, the AIDS epidemic and like other stuff that was going on in the rampant income inequality, and his economic policies, which were really bad for a lot of people, homophobia, racism, right? Like, I mean, he was distracting from his weaknesses on the home front, and people recognized that right then. One of the speechwriters said that the leading officials in the State Department, in fact, wanted no mention of the wall itself. Of course, he did mention the wall. But then, 2 years later, the Berlin Wall fell, in at the end of 1989, and the that that moment made Reagan seem like a prophet. It made it seem like he really understood that the Soviet Union was on its last legs, and a triumphalist narrative and a triumphalist version of history grows up around this speech that really uh, gives the speech an afterlife as a symbol of American courage in the face of tyranny. So the way that our session is supposed to be today is we're supposed to look at the way that that narratives are created, right? Which we also talked about. We talked about in our very first session with respect to the narratives around the poem that is on the that's on the Statue of Liberty, and the way in which, like, is that narrative true to reality or not? So one thing that we want to talk about tonight is symbols and the way that symbols are used to create story. And that is very relevant. That's a Jewish lens, because when we tell stories, we very much rely on symbols. In fact, everybody who tells stories does, but we can know our symbols, like the matzah and the maror. As we tell the story of leaving Egypt, we use tangible symbols. So one thing that we want to do is read through the speech with an eye to those symbols. And the other thing that we want to talk about is sort of examining American exceptionalism and American triumphalism, and to sort of think about what that how that vision is expressed in this speech, and how we feel about it, and how it is sort of in relationship with the Frederick Douglass speech that we looked at last time, and how their differing visions of American exceptionalism sort of play out in their speech. So those are the two lenses that our program recommends that we look at. But then it gave some extra material, including 4 examples of walls in Jewish history. And what I'd like to do is to actually emphasize that aspect. So we're going to start with the 4 walls, and then we'll go back to thinking about exceptionalism and symbols in narrative formation. And the section about the walls is in the participant workbook at the end. But before we jump into that section, which is what we're going to do next, I just wanted to show a clip from the speech, and I wanted to ask a check-in question, which is, because I'm aware, as I started out by saying that this is something that many of the people in the room, remember. So I want to have this check-in question of, what memories do you have of hearing about this speech when it happened? And when did you hear about a connection between the speech and the fall of the Berlin Wall? Like, what does this speech mean to you? How have you thought about it in your experience of history? So think about that as we jump into watching. We're just going to watch a short clip. But I think, I really liked watching the clip of the Frederick Douglass speech read by his descendants. So we're gonna watch this clip of Ronald Reagan. Here we go.
We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, If you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
So the question that I left you with is, do you remember where you were when you heard about this speech, or how does it fit into your historical memory of the fall of the Soviet Union?
Phew.
Do you remember seeing it on TV when it happened?
Oh, yeah. Again and again and again. And it was not bad to hear it again and again and again. It was so promising because Gorbachev was very promising. And you couldn't ask for something 100% different from today. All around. But I remember being very happy. Thinking about family who still were in Germany, though I didn't particularly know where. They were all in the West, it turns out. But it was just, felt great.
Do other people share Mishka's memory of having it feel great?
Remember, it was significant. I don't think I fully understood it. I mean, there's the year, 87 was when I graduated. 89, I was working in New York City. I don't remember the speech at the time. I do remember all the news about the wall coming down, but I still didn't fully understand the significance. But it's grown and grown, I think, over time as, now we see the rise of, Russia again. And it's, now that I understand history a lot more than I did when I was 20, 24, whatever I was.
I remember it, but I had an entirely different attitudes toward it. I didn't think that the wall would ever come down. And, since then, I've been to various places in this country where there are pieces of the wall that I've gone to visit, which is
Wow.
powerful.
Pieces of the Berlin Wall.
Yeah.
Wow.
I went through the various sectors in 1945 before the wall was built, from the Soviet to the French to the British to the American. And I could envision this barrier as truly being a blocking edifice to the movement and freedom of the people. I was working for New York State for Governor Cuomo at that time when he made that speech, and I just thought that was one of the first decisive challenges that an American head of state made to the Soviet Empire. Because up to that time, it was not, America did really not practice a strong stance, but rather trying to find ways of accommodation. Some might even say forms of appeasement, etc. But here was a clear, unequivocal challenge saying, tear down that wall. And what really reminded me, years later, not at the time, is Moses saying to Pharaoh, let my people go.
Mm.
Anyone else want to share the emotional resonance of that speech, of your memory of it? All right, so I'd like to look at our participant workbooks at page 11, where it says additional extension opportunities, post-session activities for further exploration. Except I think this is really fun. So we're going to do it first, and then we'll go back and see how much of the other stuff we get to. I think if they give us extra material, we're allowed to use the extra material. Anyway, and I felt like this really was an interesting exploration of walls and the way that we think about walls. I'm also going to share it on the screen, but I
Oh,
hope-
good.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
all right. So, walls in Judaism. Walls play a particular role at different moments of Jewish history, and each example demonstrates how a single symbol can have vastly different meanings. The earliest major wall image is the story of Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. The text describes an enormous military victory. Jericho was the biggest obstacle to the Israelites' initial conquest of the land, and the military victory was achieved in the way that the book of Joshua describes it, with spiritual power alone. So look at all of the spiritual elements in this quote from the book of Joshua. Now Jericho was shut up tight because of the Israelites. No one could leave or enter. That's a description of a siege. The Israelites had the walled city of Jericho under siege. And God said to Joshua, "See, I will deliver Jericho into your hands, its king and warriors. Let all your troops march around the city and complete one circuit of the city. Every day for 6 days, walk around the whole city. Do this with 7 priests carrying 7 shofars, right in front, and the Ark of the Covenant, and march all the way around the city with the priests carrying the ram's horns. And then on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, and the priests should blow the horns. And when you get to the Tekiah Gedola at the end of your 7th, at the end of your 7th Hakafa, at the end of your 7th circumambulation around the city, and when you hear the sound of that horn, all the troops, all the army of Israel should shout with the Tekiah Gedola. Make as much noise as you can. And as soon as you do that, the wall will collapse. This is a walled city, but God's going to tear down the wall. The wall will collapse, and the troops will be able to walk into the city with unhindered by the wall. So God is instructing Joshua to use the symbolic power to defeat Jericho. The parade around the city, the use of the number 7, the shofar, the shout of the people. So the question that is here is, how do these instructions separate this campaign from a typical military campaign?
They probably would have been using catapults,
Catapults or siege engines or
siege wall ladders.
grappling hooks or
Yeah.
ladders. Mhm.
Battering rams.
Battering rams. Yep. And instead of all of that, there's going to be no human violence against this wall, just walking around it.
Don't forget the giant trolls and orcs.
Sure.
Yes.
When I attack a city, I always bring in the orcs.
I kind of think of Scots using bagpipes to scare the heck out of their enemies.
Mm-hmm. So your point, Mark, is that we're not the only people that have used the sound of musical instruments as part of war. And you're absolutely right about that. Drums have been very traditionally used in war. Also trumpets, also bagpipes, also other musical instruments. Like there has always been sort of a tradition of military bands, not just to entertain the troops, though that is a big part of it, but also to memorialize and immediately tell the story of the battles, and then also to use in war, as less so now in the modern period, but definitely in earlier times. It's a
Yeah.
good
Well,
point.
certainly, it was intimidating to
Yeah.
have these kinds of sounds.
The drum beats would regulate the movement of the troops.
Sure.
But the ancient civilizations have always used noise
Yeah.
and instruments to intimidate the enemy.
So, what is the feeling about this wall in this passage? Like, is the wall good or bad? Like, is there what is it? What are the resonances of the wall, right? Clearly, Reagan is using
Of
the
that
wall
wall.
as a symbol of separation between good and evil, separation between the West and the East, separation between democracy and autocracy, between an open society and a closed society, between the American world order and the Soviet communist world order. Like, the wall is clearly a barrier, a problem, a moral evil. When Reagan says, tear down this wall, Reagan is saying, let it be so that there's freedom of movement. Like Murray was saying, that like, how could it be that Murray is able to go from the Soviet section, French section, German section, French section, British section, American section, like all of this sort of ease of movement that was available in 1945, and then the wall, soon after that, there is no more ease of movement in Germany, and clearly, like, there's a moral valence to what Reagan is saying. Is there a moral valence to the wall of Jericho? Do you think that when God says, I'm going to tear this wall down, that it has some like moral sense to it?
Well, thinking about how when the spies came back, and the 10 spies said how awful it is, and we're, if we go in, we're going to be slaughtered, and so on and so forth. This is a get back to that, get back. That wasn't the case. We're going to win. for want of a better way to say it.
Mhm.
And maybe Reagan was, saying something of the same nature. Yeah, you built this, but we're going to see to it that it's torn down, despite all of the rhetoric and actions that have happened around it.
It's removing the barriers so that there will be access to the land without any repercussions, military and dangers.
Clearly, the book of Joshua wants the Jewish people to succeed in their mission of inhabiting the land.
Mhm.
And in as much as Jericho is presenting a barrier to that, God is taking that barrier down. So I think there's like the wall is bad. Andy.
I think in this case, the wall is neutral. It's simply a barrier versus the wall in Germany was a symbol of evil or badness, right? As a matter of fact, you don't even understand until the very end, why are they circling this? You think it's just an intimidation tactic to plan a siege with battering rams and everything else. And then all of a sudden, the power of God and the voices of these humans just simply crumble the wall. And that had to be absolutely terrifying to the citizens of Jericho, right? That just such a simple motion, action knocked down the wall.
Andy points out that the wall of Jericho is actually a symbol of security for the people of
Oh,
Jericho.
yeah.
It isn't a symbol of evil, it's a symbol of security, of safety. And when God is able to completely and utterly demolish that symbol of safety, and when the Israelites are able to to conquer Jericho without any battering rams, without any military thing, with just a musical instrument, with just the sound of the shofar, that immediate loss of security is terrifying and must have terrified all of the people in the land. Like,
And-
we're coming for you.
And Rabbi, you talked about what does the wall resonate, and being in the field of resonance, I would say that it was probably around 1,000 hertz.
Nice.
Mm,
Nice. I
Okay.
did once hear, I think it was Radio Lab.
Rocket scientist.
Radio Lab did an episode on exactly what you're talking about, what it would actually take musically to take down a stone wall.
Mm.
So Radio Lab does all these really fun things. I think
Oh,
that's
it's fabulous.
in the early years, definitely worth going back to it and listening. I used to listen religiously to Radio Lab every episode. I don't have time for that anymore. All right, let's look at the next wall that is mentioned. That they've brought 4 walls in Jewish history. So the first one was the Wall of Jericho, but the next one is ghetto walls.
Mhm.
For much of Jewish history in the Middle Ages, local powers established separate neighborhoods to protect the Jewish community. Walls kept people safe inside what was often called the Jewish quarter. Later, walls came to restrict Jewish movement and socializing throughout cities, most notably in Venice, where the Jewish sector was known as the ghetto. Note in this text the positive value that the non-Jewish official, Bishop Rudiger, associates with a Jewish neighborhood and all the advantages he offers the community. So this is a text from 1084. It is Bishop of Spire is giving land and privileges to the Jews, and he writes, in the name of the
Rabbi, sorry, is that correct that the Jews initially built the walls for safety?
No, the political leaders of the city built the walls to keep the Jewish people safe. It is true that the walls of the ghettos were initially to keep Jewish people safe. They were not to keep Jews out of the rest of the city. Freedom of movement was definitely, like, they definitely had freedom of movement. In fact, for much of Jewish history, like the local duke or the local bishop or the local king or whatever would invite Jewish bankers into the city for economic reason. And because Christians weren't allowed to lend money with interest to other Christians, the Jewish people served as the bankers of Europe. So because they could lend with interest, which is the way that you make money, lending money. And so if you were the Duke and you wanted to have an influx of economic activity, you would invite a local Jewish community to move in. And often there were pogroms or there was violence against the Jewish people. And you, the bishop or whatever, you would say, don't worry, Jews, I will protect you. I'll build this wall and give you complete freedom of movement, both within the wall and in the palace and in the church. And you can come and do your money lending wherever you need to in the, public square and whatever, and you'll be able to go back into your walled area, and we'll keep the rabble out of the Jewish quarter. It was only much later where laws were passed to also restrict Jewish movement. So the Bishop of Speyer says in 1084, this is a very early text, in the name of the Holy and Indivisible Trinity, I, Rudiger, surnamed Huausman, Bishop of Speyer, when I made the villa of Speyer into a town, I thought I would increase the honor I was bestowing on the place if I brought in the Jews. In other words, I wanted to increase economic activity. Therefore, I placed them outside the town and some way off from the houses of the rest of the citizens, and lest they be too easily disturbed by the insolence of the citizens, right? I'm aware that the rabble doesn't like Jews because, by the way, we've been teaching them that the Jews are Christ killers. Okay, I surrounded them with a wall to protect them, right? Then also, just as the judge of the city hears cases between citizens, so the chief rabbi shall hear cases which arise between the Jews or against them. In other words, I'm letting the Jews have their own system of government. They will not have to go to court in the Christian court. They will not have to have their cases adjudicated by a Christian judge. The rabbi will hear the cases. But if by chance he is unable to decide any of them, then they shall go to the bishop or his chamberlain. They shall maintain watches, guards, and fortifications about their district, the guards in common with our vassals. In other words, like, the bishop is going to provide security to the Jewish community, like armed guards, a police force. They may lawfully employ nurses and servants from among our people. It actually goes on for a while. I taught this text a couple years ago. I was teaching our high school Jewish history class, and this text was part of our Jewish history class because it really speaks to this moment of the relationship between Jews and Christians, and what did that look like? And I think we were comparing that to the way that Jews were treated in Muslim lands. It's a very interesting topic, but different from our topic. We're looking at it because of its mention of this wall. So so Mark.
Call me skeptical, but it seems to me that the bishop was in his words were terrific, but I think it was a way of walling off the Jews from the Christians, keeping them separate so they wouldn't pollute the Christians with their Jewish ideas. So as far as being a protection, I'm very skeptical. It might have been his intention, but it was just a way of walling off the Jews and separating them.
So I think the last line here is the most crucial line with regard to that, which is, they may lawfully employ nurses and servants from among our people. The first thing that went in places where there were walls, and then the walls became about restricting movement as opposed to about protecting the populace, the first thing that went was always that whether the Jews could employ non-Jews in their homes, right? The fact that this bishop says we are okay with non-Jewish women going into the Jewish quarter to be babysitters and nursemaids and to take care of children and to do minor, midwifery and whatever, and to also sweep the floors and empty the chamber pots and whatever. That is the first thing that goes when what you're worried about is that Jewish ideas will infect the populace. The fact that the bishop lets the non-Jewish women come into the Jewish quarter really speaks to me about that the bishop wasn't worried about the Jewish ideas infecting the populace, because we know that that's the first thing that goes, right? Not in the Nuremberg laws in Nazi Germany, like the first thing that was passed in the Nuremberg laws was that non-Jewish women could not work in Jewish houses.
Right.
And that's not the only example. That's just the one that I know of off the top of my head. But I think also in the case of the Venice ghetto, like when it's shifted to being about keeping the Jews in and less about keeping the rabble out, the first thing that happens is that they don't let non-Jews into the ghetto.
I'm reading a book now called The Warsaw Orphans, and it deals with the ghetto in Warsaw and the wall in Warsaw. So I'm a little bit cynical when it comes to walls at this point.
Well, so I think that's I think that's part of why I think this is a really interesting case study of walls in Jewish history, because, right, say we all agreed that, with Andy's point, that the wall of Jericho was basically a neutral wall with respect to the Jewish engagement with it, right? This wall, the wall of the ghetto, clearly has some positive aspects and some negative aspects, or maybe it was created with a positive intent, but then was corrupted, right? I guess the question that I have is the wall, the Berlin Wall, which clearly by the end is being thought of as like a symbol of evil by Ronald Reagan. And Reagan is well known for having, a good versus evil sort of attitude on, not as much as George W. Not as much as him. He was very, very good versus evil. But Reagan, I think, definitely had that valence also. So, I mean, I guess the question that I have, is in what ways are walls positive and in what ways are walls negative? And here, this is a security wall to keep the Jewish people safe. We are thinking a lot about security in our synagogue. And one of the things is, what kind of wall, what kind of fence, what kind of security keeps us safe? What do we want in terms of a wall? And in what ways is that wall positive? And in what ways is that wall negative, right? Here it says, note that the Jews were allowed to have their own police force, and in fact, that police force was supplemented or paid for in part by the bishop, and a separate court system. These are hallmarks of autonomy and power. Note that they were able to hire Christian nurses and domestic workers, hallmarks of economic power. How do these powers conform to your understanding of Jewish history? How did the place of these medieval Jews compare to the place of Jews in America today? Do you think there's similarities, differences? do do the Jews inspire in 1084 have how does their freedom compare to our freedom? It's an interesting question. Andy.
I believe there was a time here, and I know in West Hartford, Jews were only allowed to move into certain neighborhoods. Right? So, and only able to join certain country clubs, or so there were a lot of social barriers, I guess I would say.
Mhm. Yeah.
Luckily,
And
most
that's
of
not
the,
that's not that long ago,
no,
right?
it's not that long ago.
No, I mean, my grandparents like specifically joined the Jewish country club in St. Louis because they couldn't join the other country clubs, right? I grew up in a town called Sharon, Massachusetts, about a half an hour south of Boston. The reason why that town was 70% Jewish when I grew up in it in the late 90s and early aughts was because it was in the 30s, 40s, 50s that town has a lake, and it was a Jewish resort town, and all the Jews in Mattapan and Dorchester, the like Jewish sections of Boston, and also some Jews from Connecticut and New York, who maybe couldn't have weren't welcome in the Hamptons or whatever, and couldn't afford to go to the Catskills. They went to Sharon, and where there was a lake and summer houses and whatever, and then their children like bought houses and lived there permanently. And so I grew up in a town that was 70% Jewish. There were seven, in a town of 16,000 people, that there were seven synagogues in walking distance to the house that I grew up in. That's like an unusual percentage, but it's because of, in fact, they weren't allowed in other places, other resorts.
Yep.
Yeah, Mark.
In Schenectady, the Mohawk Golf Club was restricted for a long time, and the German Jews built a country club, Colony Country Club, and the Russian descent Jews built the Shaker Ridge Country Club. And after a while, when country clubs kind of fell out of favor, and Mohawk Golf Club needed members, they opened it up to Jews and Italians. But those were definitely restricted.
Yep. No question. Let's look at our third wall. You might have thought that this was coming.
Yeah.
The Western Wall. When Herod expanded the temple complex in Jerusalem, he created a larger platform that required retaining walls for support. After the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, the retaining walls remained, and the one on the western side of the plaza became known as the Kotel, or the Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall. One of the earliest references to this place as sacred for the Jewish people appears in a document called the Travel Log, or the Travel Itinerary of Benjamin of Tudela. I read that in my Italian Jewish history class in rabbinical school. He traveled to the Holy Land and wrote a travel log about it. And here's his description. Templum Domini. Upon the site of the sanctuary, Omar ben al-Khattab erected an edifice with a very large and magnificent cupola, in which the Gentiles do not bring any image or effigy, but they merely come there to pray. In front of this place is the Western Wall, which is one of the walls of the Holy of Holies. This is called the Gate of Mercy, and thither come all the Jews to pray before the wall of the court of the temple. So what power does the Kotel have in Jewish spirituality and in your own personal spirituality? So the Western Wall is a wall. It's a wall, it's a retaining wall, but it's a wall, just like there are other, just like the walls of Jericho and the wall, right? Very similar in some ways to the walls of Jericho, because the Western Wall also is from the same time period. very similar time period. It is an ancient wall, an ancient stone wall. So how have you felt when you've gone to visit the wall? And do you have a sense of the, like, is it positive, negative, spiritually? Like, is this a good wall? Marcia.
Well, I just felt sort of angry when there was a separation between the women's side and the men's side. So it sort of
Yeah.
spoiled it. a
So
little.
you're actually pointing to a wall in another kind of wall, a
Yeah.
wall, you know, a mechitza, barrier wall between, you know, because right now in the state of Israel, a good portion of the Western Wall is actually an Orthodox synagogue, which is why there's a big, you know, which is why there's a big mechitza there, and it's, you know, there's also a section of the Western Wall, a little further down, closer to Robinson Arch, that is open to anyone to pray at the wall, regardless of gender. That's the part of the wall that I go to. I tend to avoid the part that's an Orthodox synagogue, and I go to the part that's open to anyone, which is called the People's Kotel, or the Plaza Ezrat Yisrael.
I pretty much had the same feeling as Marcia. Yeah, I'm supposed to be thrilled to be here. And I guess there was some sense of connecting with history. But I was not happy with what I saw and how I had to work with it. Other times I've come, I've sort of like, okay, I'll deal with this. But yeah, got me angry.
Well, I think it's interesting that in the context of talking about the Kotel wall, we actually end up talking about a different wall, the mechitza, which is also a wall, a
Yeah.
separation between genders, very common in Orthodox shuls. Murray.
No, the first time I saw the wall, it merely represented to me as a very deep religious symbol of freedom, symbol of hope, very aspirational, and it continues this way every time I'm there. I don't have that deep emotional response to the prior practices on the Temple Mount and the temple itself, the sacrifices, etc. So today just represents one as a symbol of freedom to all. And unfortunately, both what Marcia and Mishka said, that freedom is marred to some degree by some people who represent themselves as the religious police, so to speak.
Yeah, I just want to point out, right? We've been talking about walls. The Berlin Wall is a symbol of separation, of evil, like this wall around the ghetto that maybe it has some positive aspects of security and safety, but also some negative aspects of restrictions on freedom. But the Western Wall, Murray is describing the Kotel Hamaravi, like that wall is a symbol of like Jewish freedom of worship. It's marred by the fact that not all Jews are free to worship there in the same way. But what it is in essence is a symbol of freedom and of connection to historical past. And so this is clearly a wall with a very positive valence in the wall itself, not necessarily in the plaza in front of the wall. Anita.
Yeah, I wanted to say that I think we went to the wall the first time in '79, and that was relatively close to the 6-Day War, and the symbolism of the military, of the Israeli army praying at the wall when they had finally acquired the access. That's such a powerful symbol, and
Mhm.
that's often what I thought of in those days. The perception of the wall as having the Machitza is much newer now, and Mars, and to a degree, Mars that initial impact that I had in the first time seeing the wall, because we were really relatively fresh from the 6-Day War.
So let's think about this fourth wall. The fourth wall that they're describing here is the security barrier. During the Second Intifada, over 1,000 Israeli citizens were killed in terrorist attacks, like the discotheque bombings, and over 4,000 Palestinians were killed in security responses. To bring the conflict to a close, the state of Israel began constructing a huge barrier to travel between the occupied West Bank and Israel proper. I wouldn't necessarily describe it quite that way, but the project was effective and violence decreased dramatically. Large segments of this barrier are made from a massive concrete wall. Some of it is a fence, some of it is just barbed wire. But you can definitely see the concrete wall, especially right outside of Jerusalem. Here's a picture of the security barrier. The security barrier outside of Jerusalem. So what about this wall? What emotional impact? What how does this wall make you feel? Yeah,
It,
Jeff.
it really depends on your understanding of the history, our son who saw the wall and has friends who, might live on the other side of it, he thinks it's terrible. But, to anyone who lived through the Intifada, when innocent Israelis were getting blown up all the time, it's a necessary protection. And, if you live in the West Bank, you look at it as an inconvenience. And, so it's really depends which side of the wall you're on, I guess.
Anita.
Yeah, for us now, October 7th, seeing the vehicles that were used to break down the gates that separated the kibbutzim in the south from Gaza. That is frightening that
Yep.
that security wall didn't protect them.
Yep, right. It did for
For
many years,
years.
almost 2 decades.
And they came to rely on it.
And then right, walls are only as good as you patrol them and take care of them. And when you pull all of your soldiers to the West Bank and forget about Gaza, then
Mhm.
yeah.
Good fences make good neighbors.
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Actually-
I was thinking about that poem because, of course, Robert Frost is actually profoundly against walls.
Walls, yeah.
The poem is very anti-wall. He says good fences make good neighbors, and everybody remembers that line from the poem, but he actually is critiquing that idea in the poem.
Yeah.
And yet, right, like in this case, so I guess one thing that I wonder is, in what way is the security barrier that was put up between West and East Berlin similar or different from this security barrier that's put up between Israel and Palestine? Is there, in what way is the security barrier there similar to the wall of the ghetto? right? Like, I
gotta
mean, I'm
say-
saying, yeah.
What I remember about the wall was how many East Germans tried to climb over it to freedom.
And we're
It
mostly
was-
shot.
There was a, they tried, but the Soviet bloc soldiers, whatever, policemen, there were constant stories about how people trying to flee Soviet Germany were killed on
Right.
on their attempt to reach freedom. And that's what I remember about the Berlin Wall and the other walls that were all over the separation between Soviet controlled areas and the free West.
Yeah. And it's possible that some Palestinians also experience a desire to maybe not climb over the wall, but to come into
Mhm.
democratic Israel for economic prosperity and freedom, and experience it as a barrier to that, and certainly as a barrier to freedom of movement, which we talked about, Murray talked about at the very beginning. So I just thought it was interesting to think about these 4 different walls in Jewish history as we jump into looking at the text of Reagan's speech. And we're going to spend the next 20 minutes reading the text of Reagan's speech and thinking about American exceptionalism, but in the context of these different ways of thinking about what a wall is and what a wall means in Jewish
Right.
history. Mishka.
When we first started talking about the wall, I had this image of the wall in DC that has the names of those killed in Vietnam.
In Vietnam.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when the design was first proposed, there was this huge outcry that a wall? How can you use a wall in that more or less positive sense? The design itself made it such that people realized it had a whole different character to it. But there was this huge hue and cry about it. Walls are not made for these things. Walls are bad.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I think one of the things that I found really, really exciting about thinking about these different walls through Jewish history is that walls are not universally bad, and the emotional resonance and valence of these walls, it might mean different things in different times. And I think thinking about a wall in a more complex way, we bring a different mindset to it when we now turn to to Reagan's speech and the way that he uses American exceptionalism in the speech. So we're going to do this together instead of in small group dialogue. Here's an excerpt. In the 1950s, Khrushchev predicted, "We will bury you." But in the West today, we see a free world that has achieved a level of prosperity and well-being unprecedented in all human history. In the communist world, we see failure, technological backwardness, declining standards of health, even want of the most basic kind, too little food. Even today, the Soviet Union still cannot feed itself. After these 4 decades, then, there stands before the entire world one great and inescapable conclusion. Freedom leads to prosperity. Freedom replaces the ancient hatreds among the nations with comedy and peace. Freedom is the victor. In retrospect, so this is now not a quote, this is a comment. In retrospect, Soviet communism was an economic failure, and its suppression of basic freedoms is well documented. However, at the time of the speech, The United States and the USSR were competing for global influence. What memories do you have, or what stories do you remember about the contrast Reagan presents here? How do we deal with the realities of American capitalism, the wealth and innovation it creates, and the people it leaves behind? So, in other words, do we see in our own society, do we see that the people of the United States are able to feed themselves? Because we have, 15 million hungry children in our country, today. There are more
That's all?
there are more people on the street, more poor people, more unhoused people today as a result of Reaganomics than there ever were in 1960s and 1970s.
Capitalism run amok.
What?
That is capitalism run amok.
Yeah.
So,
Completely.
how do we think about that? How do we think about this?
Now, again, it's his good versus evil. Everything was all one or all the other. So American exceptionalism and capitalism is all good, and communism is all bad, and failure. So he didn't see the gray. There are some systems in Russia that probably work better than ours, but overall our system is I think proven to be better, but certainly not perfect, as we can see from the statistics of poverty and
Mhm.
huge wealth inequality, racial inequality.
We'd like to believe this is true about our society.
That
That
freedom
our-
replaces ancient hatreds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But at that time, we were at the edge of the Soviet Jewry movement. It was swelling, and within a couple of years, this was 87. By the early 90s, we were already had the movement of accepting Soviet Jews were coming to Israel, and they started to move across Europe to come to America. It was only a matter of a few years.
Yeah.
But that was Gorbachev.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He says, Mr. Gorbachev. That was Gorbachev. Yeah.
Right, but it was Gorbachev who
Yes.
made that happen,
Happened.
allowed it to happen.
Yeah. Well-
Mark?
I was just going to say I was never a Reagan fan. I'll come up right up front with that.
Ditto.
And the more that I've read, he was a very simplistic thinker. And if somebody planted an idea in his head, it never went out. Some of his ideas, this American exceptionalism, is a wonderful concept, but really we have a lot of flaws that have to be addressed, and the simplistic thinking I just think is a flaw.
Oh, yeah.
It was the speech he was giving for GE
Yeah,
when he was working for GE Theater.
right.
Oh. I forgot that.
I did too. I read it. There's a very interesting book by Andy Borowitz. It's a little snarky, but
That's Horowitz.
it's which is his nature. But it was Profiles in Ignorance, and it deals with some of our presidents who were not the brightest thinkers in the world, and it seemed that even our brightest presidents had to play dumb to get elected, which is a real shame. That somebody like Clinton had to play Elvis with his saxophone and all that to appeal to the masses, and even Obama had to play dumb at times so he could get elected, and it's just unfortunate. And Reagan didn't have to play. Neither did George W., for that matter. But you see where I'm coming from, and I apologize.
Yeah.
Here's a quote that I think has to do a lot with what Murray said about this speech. I think it was Murray. I understand the fear of war and the pain of division that afflict this continent, and I pledge to you my country's efforts to help overcome these burdens. To be sure, we in the West must resist Soviet expansion, so we must maintain defenses of unassailable strength. Yet we seek peace, so we must strive to reduce arms on both sides. But through it all, the alliance held firm. He means the NATO alliance,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
That he's yeah, okay, whatever. Not to get political. But through it all, the alliance held firm, and I invite those who protested then, and I invite those who protest today to mark this fact. Because we remained strong, the Soviets came back to the table, and because we remained strong, today we have within reach the possibility not merely of limiting the growth of arms, but of eliminating, for the first time, an entire class of nuclear weapons from the face of the earth. No, how does American exceptionalism relate to military might?
Well, here we are, 37 years later, and we seem to be in the same situation.
Yeah,
Or
except
worse.
our leaders have forgotten that
They've forgotten, yeah,
that
or conveniently
that
forgotten.
our treaties are important.
Yeah,
Republicans have certainly forgotten Reagan's words.
Yeah.
Well, I thought it was really interesting, you know, in 2016, I watched like basically the entire RNC convention and the entire DNC convention. And
Ooh.
Reagan, like Hillary Clinton, basically saw herself in that moment as like the spiritual successor to Ronald Reagan. Like the number of times that the Democratic convention quoted Ronald Reagan in the face of a Republican Party that had embraced Donald Trump was just startling to me.
Mm.
But it's just so interesting. And then people say, well, there's no real difference between the two parties, you know?
It's crazy
Murray.
to think that Reagan wouldn't be elected today, most likely.
Yeah.
Good point.
Well,
Scary.
certainly not if he ran in the Republican Party. But he probably would have a good chance of winning a Democratic nomination.
Oh, yeah. That's
Too bad he's dead.
He already served 2 terms.
Right. Yeah, that's true. He couldn't do it again.
Murray?
I'd like to say something that may sound in defense of Reagan, but he exuded a confidence in America, and the people rose up and followed it.
Yeah.
Not necessarily that not all his policies had materialized or produced long-lasting economic benefits, but I would like, and both on the economic issue and on the political issue, I still believe that our system in America that we practice and tend to let's say minimize it and abuse it is still by far better than any other system that's presently being practiced in the world. We just have to do it right, and we have to be a little bit more honest with ourselves and give our best judgments to alleviating some of the difficult issues and problems in this country. But I wouldn't substitute the economics of this country or the political structure for any other country.
I hear that.
Yeah.
I wouldn't.
So,
I wouldn't substitute other structures for our own.
yeah. So Murray says, well, there's some parts of of Reagan's belief in American exceptionalism that I can get behind. And the way that he expressed it gave a sense of confidence and patriotism and connection, and he wasn't wrong that the an idealized version of our system is better. Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Mark.
One thing you have to give Reagan, he was a real optimist and very positive in his messaging as
Yeah.
opposed to what we have now. And you have to give him credit for that. He inspired people, and that you can't take away from him.
I
He
think we're
spoke about
we're-
morning in America.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think our next quote, is about that sort of positive idea. Certainly, there's a great deal to be said for your fortitude, for your defiant courage, but I believe there's something deeper, something that involves Berlin's whole look and feel and way of life, not mere sentiment. No one could live long in Berlin without being completely disabused of illusions. Something instead that has seen the difficulties of life in Berlin but chose to accept them, that continues to build this good and proud city, in contrast to a surrounding totalitarian presence that refuses to release human energies or aspirations. Something that speaks with a powerful voice of affirmation, that says yes to this city, yes to the future, yes to freedom. In a word, I would submit that what keeps you in Berlin is love, love both profound and abiding. As I looked out a moment ago from the Reichstag, the embodiment of German unity, I noticed words crudely spray painted upon the wall, perhaps by a young Berliner. This wall will fall. Beliefs become reality. Yes. Across Europe, this wall will fall, for it cannot withstand faith. It cannot withstand truth. The wall cannot withstand freedom. And I would like, before I close, to say one word. I have read and I have been questioned since I've been here about certain demonstrations against my coming. And I would just like to say one thing to those who demonstrate so, I wonder if they've ever asked themselves if they should have the kind of government that they apparently seek. No one would ever be able to do what they're doing again. Thank you.
Mm.
God bless you all.
That's the man.
So the question here is, as Jews, how do we feel about spiritual messages coming from a president? How do we feel about the way that Reagan connected his Christianity and his spirituality to his beliefs?
But not in a denominational way.
Emory says it's okay because he wasn't trying to impose a particular belief in Jesus. He was sharing his faith with the country. Does everybody feel, does anybody have a different approach to that? I mean, all of our presidents have done that, I think. We haven't had a president who didn't speak in spiritual terms. I think it would be hard to get elected. I do. I think it would be hard to get elected. I guess the most sort of spiritual president was 45.
Yeah. Who holds the Bible upside down.
Yeah. All right. Does anybody have any other thoughts? Questions? All right. So then our next session will be at the end of March. This session was supposed to be February 29th, but there's a Federation program at Congregation Agudat Achim on February 29th, which everybody should come to. It's
Really good speaker.
Yeah, it's a really funny. He's a comedian, and
Oh, that's
I
the one.
saw him, Joel Chazanoff, so worth coming to, and also it's really nice that Federation is back at Congregation Nagad Achim, and really lovely. So our next session is the 28th of March, and our next
Got that.
and our next session is Sojourner Truth. Ain't I a Woman? And I'll send out the participant workbook probably tomorrow, or so that people can look at it. All right. Thank you so
Alright.
much for this engaging conversation about walls and the spiritual resonance of walls, and tearing walls down like Jericho and the Berlin Wall, and then thinking about walls that we want to put up, and what walls are good and what walls aren't good, and how do we think about American exceptionalism, especially as income inequality and injustice has in some ways increased over the last decades,
Mm.
and definitely something to think about as we think about Ronald Reagan's legacy and memory and as we continue to go forward into the 21st century. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Good night.